Good evening. Excellent. Honorable Sean Edwards, Minister for Education, Sustainable Development, Innovation, Science, Technology, and Vocational Training. Your Excellency, Dr. Christoph Eick, Ambassador of the Federal Republic of Germany to the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago and Special Envoy for Climate Issues in the Caribbean. Your Excellencies, distinguished participants, esteemed guests, online viewership. Welcome to Loss and Damage in the Caribbean, the Toll of the Climate Crisis, part of the German Climate Talk series. I am Natalie Jolie Fanis, and it's a pleasure to be your host this evening. I would like to start off by thanking the Special Envoy for Climate Issues in the Caribbean, the Ambassador for the Federal Republic of Germany, His Excellency Dr. Christoph Eick, for spearheading this Germany-Caribbean Climate Talks series, which is aimed at empowering the region with information on the global developments on critical issues such as just transition and loss and damage. This event is so timely, as we are all aware of how our region continues to cope with the recent effects of the historic Hurricane Beryl. And it's historic because it's the earliest recorded Atlantic hurricane. We are seeing the result of the warnings of climate scientists that increased global temperatures caused by rising greenhouse gases emissions will result in increasingly severe extreme events such as hurricanes, with islands suffering severe loss and damage from this hurricane and continuing to brace for the rest of the hurricane season. Serious conversations on loss and damage are essential. So we have gathered here with an extraordinary cast of presenters and panelists who you will meet later. Our presenters will be followed by an interactive panel discussion, and you, the audience, will have an opportunity to ask the presenters questions after the discussion. We will begin, though, with His Excellency Dr. Christoph Eick for the official welcome. In addition to Trinidad and Tobago, His Excellency also serves as Ambassador to Antigua and Barbuda, Barbados, Dominica, Grenada, Guyana, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and Suriname. And as noted before, His Excellency is also the German Special Envoy for Climate Issues in the Caribbean. Your Excellency, welcome to the stage.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Jolie Fanis, for introducing me, and the Honorable Sean Edward, Minister for Education, Sustainable Development, Innovation, Science, Technology, and Vocational Training. It sounds a little bit like my title with all these lovely islands and states that I'm covering from Port of Spain. Excellencies, distinguished participants, dear guests, a very warm welcome to the German Caribbean Climate Talks organized by the German Embassy together with Climate Analytics Caribbean. It is indeed a pleasure to be back in St. Lucia and to see so many of you this evening. And I would like to take this opportunity, of course, to congratulate all of St. Lucia on Julian Alfred's historic performances at the Paris Olympics. There is certainly no lack of talent in the Caribbean. Distinguished participants, Climate Talks is a format that German embassies around the world use as part of an effort to shine the light on one of the most pressing, if not the most pressing, issues of our time, climate change. I think it is fair to say that here in St. Lucia and in the Caribbean more generally, there's actually no need to shine the light on climate change. It is there for us to see, to feel, and to experience. So our climate talks in the Caribbean focus on particular issues connected with climate change. In May, our climate talks in Trinidad and Tobago focused on just transition. And for this evening, we have chosen the topic of loss and damage. Distinguished participants, loss and damage refers to the negative effects of climate change that occur despite mitigation and adaptation efforts. While mitigation addresses the causes of climate change, like reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and adaptation addresses the impacts, like building seawalls to prevent flooding, loss and damage is concerned with the unavoidable and irreversible impacts of the climate crisis. It comes to no surprise that small island developing states like St. Lucia and the region more generally have been at the forefront when climate negotiators established the Loss and Damage Fund in Sharm el-Sheikh and in Dubai. SIDS bear the brunt of climate change, including from slow onset events such as sea level rise, and the financial resources at their disposal are limited compared with the losses and damages a single hurricane can cause. As many of you know, Germany has been an early advocate of the Loss and Damage Fund and has already committed $100 million to the fund. Distinguished participants, we will no doubt learn a lot from our featured speakers and panelists this evening. But let me leave you with three thoughts. First, national efforts to address loss and damage remain essential. The fund's aim should not be to provide a substitute for governments' own efforts, but rather to strengthen and support them. Second, vulnerable countries, in the context of loss and damage, should continue to invest in climate risk insurance. Germany and the Vulnerable 20 group, the V20, are spearheading the global shield against climate risks, which aims at providing more and better prearranged protection against climate and disaster-related risks. Closer to home, the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, CCRIF, provides disaster risk finance products and services to Caribbean and Central American member countries. Significant payouts were made by CCRIF following the passage of Hurricane Beryl. Third, mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage are inextricably linked. If we do not manage to make headway on adaptation, climate-related loss and damage will reach unaffordable levels. And if we do not manage to stop greenhouse gas emissions, adaptation at some point will become impossible. In fact, arguably the biggest contribution a country like Germany can make in the fight against climate change is to further limit and eventually stop greenhouse gas emissions. I would encourage you to continue to put pressure on Germany and on all large emitters to do their part in safeguarding our planet. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. First, for your permission to continue to put pressure. We heard that loud and clear. And also for recognizing the impact caused on our vulnerable states and for Germany's contribution towards the fund. We do appreciate that. And we look forward to increased cooperation between Germany and the Caribbean. Thank you so much to His Excellency. Once again, a round of applause. It is now my pleasure to welcome our keynote address from our Minister of Education. The Honorable Sean Edward is a senior government minister and a three-time member of parliament for Dennery North, having won that seat for the St. Lucia Labour Party in the general elections of 2011, 2016, and 2021, respectively. He served as Minister for Youth Development and Sports from 2011 to 2016. Honorable Edward currently holds the position of Second Deputy Political Leader of the St. Lucia Labour Party, Minister of Education, Sustainable Development, Innovation, Science, Technology, and Vocational Training. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Honorable Minister.
I sit back and I listen to chairpersons read out my portfolio responsibilities, and I always ask myself, is the salary commensurate with the range of responsibilities that I have been handed by the Honorable Prime Minister? Ambassador Ike, representatives of regional and international organizations, specially invited guests, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Ambassador, you said that we ought to put pressure on Germany. I thought I was the only one who took notice of this. I noticed Dr. Fletcher was chuckling when you said so. And when you said that the Caribbean is a rich repository of talent, given Julian's exploit, I want to forewarn you that we have a propensity to apply pressure when pressure has to be applied. As St. Lucia and the wider Caribbean region face what is anticipated to be one of the most active hurricane seasons on record, with above normal hurricane activities predicted in the Atlantic Basin, we stand at a critical juncture. We must urgently ask ourselves, are we doing enough by way of readiness and resilience building? The answer to this question can potentially be daunting. However, it is a battle we cannot afford to concede. For small island developing states like St. Lucia, the climate crisis presents a unique set of challenges. Our small size and vulnerability make us particularly susceptible to the impacts of climate change, and without decisive action, these impacts will become even more critical. Our need for financial resources, further to technology transfer and capacity building to support our planning and recovery efforts from climate-related events is growing, and the science is unequivocal. Unless we reduce greenhouse gas emissions, global temperatures will continue to rise, leading to catastrophic consequences for us. The continuous trend of rising temperatures is already having a profound impact on our lives, on our livelihoods, and on our food and water security. Despite the complexities and uncertainties surrounding climate change, the urgency of our responses cannot be overstated. Climate change does not spare anyone, and certainly not the 248 square mile island that is St. Lucia. As OECS and Caribbean, we have taken cognizance of the fragility of our economies and the vulnerabilities that come naturally with our geographic location. The Caribbean is the second most disaster-prone region in the entire world. We are also aware of the richness of our natural and cultural assets, too precious to gamble away at the hands of climate change. This is why we have been steadfast and deliberate in our national response to climate change. We have witnessed the historic milestone achieved at COP28 in Dubai, where a significant agreement was reached to establish a loss and damage fund to support countries most vulnerable to climate impacts. For St. Lucia, this was a significant breakthrough. Since loss and damage has been a thematic area in the climate change discourse that we have ardently championed alongside our CARICOM and OASIS colleagues. Indeed, on the international front, further to having led on loss and damage for seeds, St. Lucia served on the executive committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage for 6 years, including serving as co-chair for 2 terms, in addition to functioning as thematic coordinator for loss and damage for CARICOM and AOSIS over that period. The efforts of my ministerial predecessors, one of whom is here today, in the Department of Sustainable Development must be applauded, along with the contributions of the technical staff who continue to work very diligently. For more than 30 years, ours has been a voice of advocacy, and as the dust settles on the key milestone from cumulative efforts over a period of 30 years, we must ask ourselves, what happens next? Are we as a nation, as a small island developing state, prepared to access these funds? I can answer on behalf of all St. Lucians and by extension the Caribbean and say yes. The upcoming COP29 in Azerbaijan, aptly dubbed the Finance COP, will bring the issue of implementation and tangible climate action into sharp focus. As seeds, responding to climate challenges necessitates support from developed country partners to preserve our communities and our way of life. We need global leadership and decisive action on climate finance, and we need it now. In St. Lucia, we take pride in our vigorous efforts to address climate change through mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage strategies. Our National Adaptation Plan, or NAP, covering a decade, 2018 to 2028, includes priority measures for 8 key sectors and addresses limits to adaptation. We have highlighted potential action to tackle loss and damage within a comprehensive climate risk management framework. Additionally, we are progressing with a needs-based assessment for loss and damage as part of our GCF NAP readiness project, seeking to enhance our preparedness for accessing international funds once fully operationalized. Our commitment to climate action is further demonstrated by the revision of our nationally determined contribution, NDC 3.0, under the Paris Agreement. Incidentally, it is worth noting that our second NDC includes loss and damage. Although our contribution to global emissions is negligible, St. Lucia continues to lead by example. We are investing in renewable energy and carbon sequestration interventions. Recently, our government approved the National Energy Policy 2023 to 2030, underscoring our dedication to strengthening energy security, reducing supply costs, and fulfilling our NDC commitments. To bolster our climate efforts, we have also enacted legislation in that regard. The Climate Change Bill became law in St. Lucia earlier this year. As we advance, we must remember that no island is an island unto itself. We share the pain and also facilitate the recovery of our neighboring islands after every catastrophic weather event. Our meeting today is timely. We are convening at a time when the region is still reeling from the effects of Hurricane Beryl. Mopping up operations are still ongoing, and in some cases, people are still literally picking up the pieces. We must truly embrace the concept of no island left behind. As I conclude, I want to register our government's gratitude to all the regional and international agencies and friendly governments that have supported us along this journey. I hope that today's discussions will foster a mindset of learning, innovation, and a stronger call to action. Let us unite in our efforts, for together we are stronger, and together we can make a vast difference. Let us continue to be voices of advocacy and champions of the climate action. I thank you.
Honorable Minister, thank you so much for this very informative keynote address outlining St. Lucia's role and the measures that have been put in place to safeguard our people, the policies as well. We're happy to hear that laws have been enacted and that much is being done by the government to protect our country and our region. So our focus here is on loss and damage. So we're really going to get into the experts now. So to share more about the development of loss and damage in international climate negotiations, I am pleased to welcome Ms. Ruana Haynes for a special presentation on the loss and damage outcome at COP28, as well as insights on current regional initiatives on loss and damage, particularly on the Island Advancement Project. And just so that we know more about our presenter, Ms. Haynes is the Director of Climate Analytics Caribbean, an organization dedicated to the creation of a climate-safe, sustainable, and just future for all. Her work is focused on the many dimensions of climate justice. Ms. Haynes also works to support the Alliance of Small Island States in climate change negotiations through strategic and technical advice, as well as capacity building. Please welcome to the stage, Ms. Ruana Haynes.
Hello, everybody. Good evening. The Honorable Sean Edward, Minister of Education, Sustainable Development, Innovation, Science, Technology, and Vocational Training. Your Excellency, Dr. Christoph Eick, Ambassador of the Federal Republic of Germany to the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago and Special Envoy for Climate Issues in the Caribbean, representatives of regional organizations, excellencies, panelists, specially invited guests, and our audience online. Hello once again and welcome to this special event. It's a real pleasure to have all of you here with us this evening and online. I heard from my colleagues earlier that this has been one of our most subscribed events, and that, I guess, comes with no surprise. Loss and damage has been one of the most critical issues for the Caribbean region since we have been addressing the climate crisis, and since the existence of the UN Convention on Climate Change, which is about 30 years old. I'm really pleased to be here in St. Lucia today. As Ambassador Eick mentioned, this is the second of the German Climate Talks series of events, with the first having been held in Trinidad and Tobago earlier this year. In the discussions that we had when we decided that we wanted to look at the theme of loss and damage, I felt that it was only right that we are able to host this event in St. Lucia. As the Minister mentioned, St. Lucia has been at the forefront in the Caribbean when it comes to climate action. St. Lucia has been leading, in fact, leading from the front, in particular, on this issue of loss and damage. And so we're really happy to be here to discuss with this audience today. So a little bit about who is Climate Analytics. Climate Analytics is a global climate science and policy institute engaged around the world in driving and supporting climate action aligned to a 1.5 degrees Celsius warming limit. And we heard from Ambassador Eick the key or critical importance of mitigation action and being able to limit global warming as one of the main ways that we can help to arrest and address loss and damage in vulnerable regions of the world, such as here in the Caribbean. So Climate Analytics has been connecting science and policy to empower vulnerable countries in international climate negotiations and inform national planning with targeted research, analysis, and support. As Climate Analytics Caribbean, the newest Climate Analytics Office, we have been working specifically on creating those linkages, those additional linkages that we thought were necessary between what is happening at the global level in the international process and what is taking place in the region on the ground, because there are some gaps. And so I want to focus a little bit on, as our host has indicated, two things. One, where we're at in the global discussion on loss and damage. And then two, I want to introduce you a little bit to some of the work of Climate Analytics Caribbean in these areas. We have two key reports, one that has already been launched in June and one that will be launched at COP this year in November. And I want to share with you some of the findings of those reports as food for thought and to inform the panel discussion that is going to be coming up shortly. So last year at COP28, we had a really critical outcome in relation to loss and damage. As many of you may know, we established the Loss and Damage Fund, or the fund to address loss and damage, the year before at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, and this was a seminal decision. In fact, the road to the establishment of that fund was indeed quite rocky, and there are many in the room who could attest to that. I can tell you, having been in Sharm el-Sheikh, that even a few days before the decision was taken, a colleague negotiator looked at me and said to me, with all seriousness, that a loss and damage fund would be established here under over his dead body. I'm pleased to report that he is very much still alive. And we do have a loss and damage fund. But that was just the first part of the story. It was important that we took that decision in Sharm el-Sheikh, but we then had a very long road to go in order to ensure that the fund could be operationalized. And that was the work that took place between 2022 and 2023 on the road to COP28 last year in Dubai. And that work was not without its challenges, but eventually successful in ensuring that the nuts and bolts of how the fund would function have in fact mostly been agreed. I will not say that they are complete in their work, but we are at a point where hopefully once the funds that have been pledged to the fund, and I think at last count it was somewhere in the range of $7 billion. Once those funds are received, the Loss and Damage Fund will be soon in a position to begin disbursement. And this is really a very significant milestone that we've now reached. There are some difficult issues still that are under discussion, and some issues that were very, very difficult to resolve indeed. So the question of where the fund would be hosted, for example, is one of them. The fund will sit with the World Bank, and as many of those who would have been involved in any type of development and accessing development financing would know, the World Bank has not always been the easiest entity, especially for vulnerable countries to be able to access when you look at the requirements, when you look at the quality of the funding that is available. And so some very difficult compromises were reached. The fund will be there in a trial period. At the end of that period, there will be a review and a decision will be taken as to whether it will remain with the World Bank. And this compromise was necessary to ensure that arrangements could be put in place for the fund to be operationalized by COP28, which they have now been. We also have very difficult discussions ongoing on who can access the fund and who actually pays into the fund. And this, although it is specific to the operation of the Loss and Damage Fund itself, also sits as part of a broader discussion on climate finance on the whole. In the agreement on the fund, we identify that the funds are to be directed to those that are particularly vulnerable to climate change. And us in the Caribbean region understand that we are definitely a part of that category, but for others, it's a lot less clear. And so there are discussions ongoing on how that particular vulnerability will be understood. What does it mean? What are the thresholds in place to ensure that it can be a fund that allows for equitable access with priority to those that need it the most. There are a number of other issues that are still under discussion, hotly debated, but at the beginning of COP28, we were able to agree on the decision that finally operationalizes the fund, which again was a decision that many thought would be slow in coming, if at all, and definitely not by the deadline that had been set. And in fact, it was agreed on the very first day of the COP last year. At this point, one of the key issues, and I think the minister asked this question, so what's next? One of the key issues is looking at this question of the global governance of loss and damage. This is a question that is going to be examined this year on the road to COP29 and at COP29. We now have a loss and damage fund established last year, operationalized last year. We have the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage established in 2013, and we have the Santiago Network on loss and damage. And these three entities set up either under the UN Convention on Climate Change or the Paris Agreement all have a role to play in how the international community responds to the needs of countries that are particularly vulnerable to climate change and really suffering the impacts of loss and damage. But there is still a lot to be decided on how those three entities are able to coordinate their efforts so that they facilitate instead of hinder. And we don't always get it right at the international level with setting up institutions that help to facilitate and address the needs of the most vulnerable and not exacerbate them. So you can see how this is quite an important conversation that is upcoming. So I think I will stop there in terms of what's happening at the international level and what are the latest developments, because I want to share with you a little bit about the work that we've been doing at Climate Analytics Caribbean as it relates to loss and damage. At present, in line with our vision for a climate-safe, sustainable, and just future for all, we are currently undertaking a 2-year regional loss and damage project focused on CARICOM countries that is being funded by the Open Society Foundations. The project comprises 3 components: a Caribbean research agenda on loss and damage, regional dialogues on loss and damage, and a public awareness, education, and engagement on loss and damage issues in the region. And if you'd like to read more about and learn more about what we're doing and the information that we're sharing, please feel free to follow us. We're very active on social media across all of your favorite social media sites, including X, formerly known as Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, where we are sharing a lot of information coming out of the work that we're doing. So in the first instance, we've launched a report in June on the review of loss and damage in the Caribbean from 1994 to 2024. And this report is the first of its kind to provide a systematic overview of how Caribbean countries are framing and reporting on loss and damage. In terms of the findings of this report, we've noted that loss and damage in the Caribbean is being reported generally as economic costs associated with a climate event, mainly hurricanes and flooding. Many other climate hazards considered important by small island developing states, therefore, tend to go unreported, as do the impacts of slow onset events such as drought, sea level rise, sargassum blooms, or coral bleaching. So there is a gap in how we in the region are understanding, speaking about, and reporting about loss and damage. And this gap needs to be addressed in order to ensure that we are truly able to access the funds that will be available from the Loss and Damage Fund in a way that addresses the issue in all of its various dimensions. So some of the key recommendations for Caribbean SIDS on future loss and damage research priorities include the development and implementation of a common regional approach for loss and damage reporting. We think that as a region, it would be useful to establish a common framework for how we understand loss and damage. That shares the work a bit, so it's not just up to one country, and it allows for deepening regional cooperation and coordination on this critical issue. And it will also set us up as a region, again, to be able to access funding more efficiently. And we're also recommending the development of national plans or programs to address loss and damage. Whereas many countries in the region do have national climate change policies, and the minister mentioned, for example, St. Lucia does have a national climate change bill now and has included loss and damage in the context of the NDC. We've noted that there is a lack of plans and policies specifically focused on addressing loss and damage as a key issue. So the second report, which will be launched at COP29 in November, and we will also have a webinar for regional consultations at the end of October, focuses on loss and damage and debt sustainability in the Caribbean. So I think we're all aware here of the fact that Caribbean SIDS are also grappling with high fiscal debt, being one of the most indebted regions in the world. The estimated costs of losses and damages as a result of climate change borne by Caribbean countries sit on top of costs of reconstruction and recovery post-disaster. So what we're seeing is that as part of the new normal, as climate impacts intensify, Caribbean countries may find themselves in a vicious cycle of reconstruction and recovery, which further escalates public debt while increasing debt servicing costs and limiting fiscal space, which could be utilized for implementing sustainable development and long-term climate actions. So there is a quite toxic relationship happening between high indebtedness and the impacts of climate change, especially as it relates to loss and damage. Financing that should and could be directed towards sustainable development objectives, plans, and policies is instead lost in this cycle of reconstruction and recovery, which is, really being fueled by borrowing, borrowing, borrowing. And as one of my colleagues has said, when thinking about this relationship in the Caribbean, it is impossible and it is actually unjust to think that as a region that has not been responsible for causing the climate crisis, we can borrow ourselves into resilience, we can borrow ourselves into sustainability. It simply does not work that way and shouldn't work that way. So this is part of the reason why for us it was important to be able to study this relationship and draw out some of the key areas for further attention, excuse me, in particular for policymakers. Some preliminary findings from the research show, one, that the current debt crisis is linked to the climate crisis as the effects of climate change push countries to borrow more and drive up capital costs, leading to the vicious cycle that I would have described. Secondly, 8 of 15 CARICOM countries most at risk from climate change-related disasters are in fact already in debt distress or at high risk of becoming so. And being in debt distress means that these countries are already at risk of being unable to service their debt payments and may be in need of debt restructuring efforts. Thirdly, CARICOM countries face substantial economic losses and damages across sectors like infrastructure, health, food security, and ecosystems due to their geographical isolation, small populations, and reliance on ocean resources. Climate-related disasters require significant spending on recovery and adaptation, exacerbating debt levels and undermining debt sustainability. So we know that ensuring that we can have effective climate action, in fact, will require a rapid increase in the mobilization of international climate finance on the whole, and would also require fiscal space and affordable capital to implement far-reaching economic reforms and climate mitigation and adaptation measures, both of which are increasingly out of reach for a growing number of countries. And as was mentioned earlier by the Minister, we're heading into what has been dubbed a finance COP, where a number of these issues are going to be on the table, hopefully for some type of resolution this year. We also have one final recommendation for the consideration of policymakers in the region, and that is that CARICOM member states, heads of state, ministers of finance, central banks, ought to be integrating climate risk assessments into their debt sustainability analyses. Even though we understand from the data that is available that there is this toxic relationship happening between climate change, loss and damage, and debt sustainability, there still remains a bit of a policy gap in terms of how this is actually being addressed and acknowledged at the regional level. So this research intends to, in fact, examine this intricate relationship, looking at the debtor types mostly affected, and also looking at and trying to draw out debt-based solutions that exist to, in fact, minimize the strain on public finance of dealing with the climate crisis. And we have a working paper that will be available for consultation, and the consultation is taking place on the 23rd of October, 2024. So I'll end here. Thank you all very much for your kind attention, and I look forward to the discussion and the rest of the event.
I'm sure Ms. Haynes could keep going, and I know that there are some questions for her. At the end of our panel, you will have an opportunity possibly to fill in any gap that she may have missed that you want to know more about. But we really want to thank Ms. Haynes for this very important update on how we are represented at COP and the work of climate analytics. And let me echo her appeal to you to follow them on the social media pages, because this is definitely an entity that we should be following to find out more about our representation on the world stage, especially as it relates to loss and damage. So, ladies and gentlemen, we move to the second segment of our evening, and that is the panel discussion, where you will have an opportunity to hear from our expert panelists and have a chance to ask them questions. So we will start with them individually, and then we will move to a group panel discussion. So this evening's panelists include Mr. Crispin Dovey, who is representing His Excellency Dr. Didacus Jules, Director General of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, who regretfully cannot be here this evening. Dr. James Fletcher, who is the founder of the Caribbean Climate Justice Project, Chairman of Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, and of course, a worker for climate justice with the youth in particular, and I'm sure he will talk about that during his presentation. And Ms. Kathleen Carew Afrifa is the founder and executive director of Helen's Daughters, HD, a nonprofit organization committed to addressing gender inequity in the agricultural sector. So we are going to begin with our first panelist, who's going to represent Dr. Jules. He sends his regrets, but we have with us, in his stead, Mr. Crispin Duvey, who is the Program Director for Climate and Disaster Resilience at the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, the OECS. Mr. Duvey is a St. Lucia national, and he previously worked for many years with the government of St. Lucia in the field of fisheries, natural resources, environment, and energy, with his final position in government being the Chief Sustainable Development and Environment Officer. And in that position, he served as the country's lead technical negotiator on climate change. So very, very qualified to speak with us here this evening. He's rolling his eyes, but ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Crispin Duvey.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Honorable Minister, Excellency, distinguished colleagues, friends, old friends. Dr. Jules, unfortunately, is not able to be here this evening, but he did prepare some remarks, so I will deliver them if you'll allow me. Brief. Since the 1970s, the Caribbean has faced increasingly intense hurricanes. And with every hurricane season, we ask, will we be hit? How many times? How severely? Are we prepared? These concerns are valid because forecasting hurricane patterns remains imprecise. Storms can change trajectory or intensity unexpectedly, causing widespread damage. For example, Hurricane Ivan in 2004, originally predicted to hit St. Lucia, instead devastated Grenada, causing over $1 billion in damage. Hurricane Thomas in 2010, a Category 1 storm, mind you, caused massive flooding in St. Lucia, resulting in $336 million in damage. Similarly, Hurricane Beryl in 2024 became the earliest Category 5 storm ever recorded, causing $730 million in damage across the Grenadines. These storms illustrate the visible and destructive impacts of climate change. However, there are more subtle but equally damaging consequences, such as rising sea levels, coastal erosion, and higher temperatures affecting marine ecosystems and human health. The impacts of climate change are multidimensional, multiscalar, and interconnected, contributing to severe loss and damage. Small island nations like those in the Caribbean are particularly vulnerable. While we once feared only the winds, it is now clear that increased rainfall intensity and sea level rise are just as destructive. Tropical Storm Erica, for instance, in 2015, and Hurricane Thomas of 2010 caused more damage through rain than through wind. Loss and damage goes beyond what we can adapt to or mitigate. Even developed nations would struggle to cope with 24 inches of rainfall in 24 hours, like we experienced during Hurricane Thomas. For the Caribbean facing more intense weather patterns, the outlook is dire, complicating our path to sustainable development. Assessing loss and damage is therefore critical. While we can quantify losses in sectors like agriculture and tourism, some losses defy easy measurement. How, for example, do we value the loss of archaeological sites washed away by rising seas, or the damage to coral reefs due to higher sea temperatures? And how do we account for displaced communities or destroyed livelihoods? Our assessments must combine quantitative, semi-quantitative, and qualitative methods supported by sustained research. This includes identifying and mapping natural and cultural assets, assessing vulnerabilities, and calculating the cost of resilience measures. We also need to determine the limits of our ability to adapt and to define the gap between what is technically and financially feasible and what is not. Regionally, collaboration is essential. We can work together to monitor and adapt to sea level rise and build capacity for displaced communities due to extreme events. Further, we must strengthen our health sector to address trauma caused by climate disasters. The Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, CRIF, has been a significant achievement, but there is room for further development of affordable insurance products in the region. Earlier this month, we held a consultation on insurance for the agriculture and fisheries sectors, involving rich discussion with stakeholders. It was clear from this meeting that parametric insurance is best suited to mitigate risk in vulnerable socioeconomic sectors, but we need financial resources to manage this. The establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund is a step forward, but the funding is far below what is required, and our recommendation is that a percentage of loss and damage funds be allocated to parametric coverage. Caribbean nations are doing their part to build resilience and reduce emissions, but we cannot tackle climate change alone. Large emitters must take responsibility by aggressively reducing emissions and supporting developing countries like ours in implementing national climate change strategies. Germany has been a leader in pushing for greater climate ambition and has provided significant support to the Caribbean. We look forward to continued cooperation with Germany at both the national and regional levels, with a focus on tailored approaches for the unique needs of the OECS countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Duvet. Let me invite you to have a seat next to me, because now we open the floor to our audience for some questions to Mr. Duvet, who is ably representing the director. My instructions are that each panelist will have just 10 minutes of questions, and then we move to the next presenter. So let's start this way and see how it goes. If there are no pressing questions, then we can move on. But ladies and gentlemen, the floor is open for Mr. Duvet for any questions you may have for him. I could start the ball rolling. You all are still thinking? Well, we really want to know the position of the OECS as it regards loss and damage. So, Mr. Duvet, can you speak to some of the biggest wins and possibly the biggest drawbacks in addressing the issue of loss and damage in the OECS?
I'm not sure it's a question of wins, because we fought a long, hard fight. And before I go any further, I want to say that we have some world-class experts in this room, people who actually build this loss and damage, machine or whatever you want to call it, in Paris. You have Dr. Fletcher, you have Don P. Nathaniel, who, they rendered the human service in making, loss. We have Rwanda here. Okay, so very often, we look at the product, but we forget the people who actually built it. So I think, we have to give that kudos while we can. But having said so, in the OECS, obviously, we try to support our member states in their efforts, recognizing their sovereignty, but we also try to take regional approaches where possible. And in some areas, we've taken some steps in some areas. For example, again, with the kind support of the government of Germany, trying to elaborate on issues such as human mobility in the context of climate change, trying to understand the impact that climate change has on people when it comes to, for example, displacement and forced migration. You will remember the fact that people had to leave Dominica, for example, sometimes having lost everything they had, and to move to St. Lucia, move to other Caribbean islands, Antigua, for example. And, fortunately, the OECS, given its dedication to free movement of people, goods, and services, we have a system a framework where people can leave, certainly in the protocol member states can move from St. Lucia, for example, go to Dominica, stay indefinitely, work, etc. So these protocols are in place. But we've also elaborated, tried to understand what are some of the factors we have to consider. What happens to the displaced persons when they move to St. Lucia? Okay, what are their needs? What are their concerns? Okay, what needs to be done in terms of our social safety net? we've tried to elaborate that conversation so that we can at least have some kind of understanding of what, how we can better prepare as, events such as, a Beryl and as an Ivan, for example, as, they become, even more intense and more frequent. So at least we're not caught flat-footed. So these are some of the regional, that's just one example of a regional approach that we can take.
I see a question in the back, but this is very interesting. A lot of times when you hear about us recovering, it's a lot of infrastructure, a focus on infrastructure. And this focus on the individual, on the human being, is definitely one we need to applaud. We have a gentleman in the back. There's a mic up in the front, and we also have a roving mic that we can use to ensure that we have an online audience who needs to hear you as well. So we appreciate if you would ask your question in the mic. Feel free to identify yourself as well, sir.
The name is Augusta St. Luce, and I'm an entrepreneur. You mentioned reducing emissions. Are there any current projects ongoing that sort of speaks to that? And in terms of businesses who are trying to make that transition from what it is that they are currently moving into eco-friendly businesses, is there any assistance being made available for these companies or businesses to help in the reduction of emissions?
Okay, that's a multi-dimensional, multifaceted question with many answers. But the question is, how much time do you have? But seriously though, I would have to say yes, because if you just look at it at the national level, and I can use St. Lucia. I know, and that was when in a previous life, when I worked with the government of St. Lucia, through the PPCR project, that's the pilot program for climate resilience, we were able to negotiate a loan facility which went to the St. Lucia Development Bank for what is known as a CAF, the Climate Adaptation Financing Facility, which allowed households, businesses, and so on to transition to climate resilient, approaches using whether it was solar and so on. Building resilience within, for example, retaining walls and so on, according to the parameters defined by the bank. Of course, by the time it came into force, I had already left the government. So there are people who are even better qualified to give you, the details of that, how that facility worked. Right now at the OECS level, we have, under our larger framework of the NDC Finance Initiative, we are actually working on an initiative known as the Eastern Caribbean Solar Challenge, where we're now looking to upscale and increase the uptake of solar. And in fact, God willing, I'm hoping that next week we'll be in a position to announce something significant if all goes well over the weekend. I can't say more than that, but but yes, but the idea is really to promote the diffusion of solar, and we're working with one of our partners on this, and we're really hoping that we can announce something significant in the coming days and weeks. But we certainly are committed to this, and we certainly believe in the regional approach, because in the past, when for example, when there was something called the under the Kyoto Protocol of the Climate Convention, we were not able to get much support because we were too small. Okay, only Jamaica got a significant project. No, all the islands were passed over because we were too small. But if we can bundle ourselves and have a bigger footprint and make ourselves more attractive to potential investors, that is something that that can make the difference. But there's certainly a lot of stuff in the works, and I'll be happy to talk with you more about it. Like I said, how much time do you have?
We have to take a question now from our online audience, and it's specifically for the OECS. So Andrea Richards asks, how can we better integrate heritage on the loss and damage discourse? And how can the OECS Secretariat support this push? Good
question, and a necessary one. I again, I think in the remarks delivered by our director, I delivered on behalf of our Director General, we mentioned the whole issue of cultural assets and so on. We have to recognize that one of the things I think is important in the region is for us to better understand and quantify and determine the contribution of, what I want to call the non-traditional sectors. For example, the orange economy, right? Culture, our heritage assets and so on. We need to better map these, and we need to do that on a regional basis as well. And they take a collective approach. Increasingly, the OECS is recognizing the need to go into that field and to broaden our work, because we work a lot with the natural environment, and so on, and to some extent the built environment and so on. But we recognize the need to go to move in that direction, and I think we're trying to increasingly embrace the orange and some of the non-traditional sectors, which include heritage. So I think in the years to come, you're going to see more work being done in that regard.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Dovey. I will have you return to your seat temporarily, and after our other two presenters, we will have our full discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for Mr. Dovey. We now invite to the podium one of the Caribbean's stalwarts and one of our most avid climate champions, Dr. James Fletcher. Dr. James Fletcher is the former Minister for Public Service, Sustainable Development, Energy, Science and Technology in St. Lucia. He led the Caribbean's delegation to the negotiations on the Paris Agreement in 2015 and was an integral part of the region's 1.5 to Stay Alive climate change civil society advocacy campaign. Dr. Fletcher has served as chairman of the CARICOM Regional Task Force on Sustainable Development and the Regional Coordinating Committee on Climate Change. He's the chairman of the executive board of the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, the director of Solaricon, and he's also the founder of the Caribbean Climate Justice Project. And I learned a little bit about negotiations from Dr. Fletcher when I eavesdropped on his youth panel this summer. So Dr. Fletcher, thank you so much for being here, and we invite you now to offer your insights on small island developing states' fight for the loss and damage fund. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. James Fletcher.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Natalie. And you switched it off. Honorable Sean Edward, Minister for Education and the portfolio that I once had. Make it easier for me to remember. Your Excellency, Ambassador, Excellencies, friends, ladies and gentlemen. I decided to be different. The people before me are much better looking than I am, so you could stare at them for a long time. I decided that I wanted to draw your attention to the screen and not to my face, so that's why I'm doing it this way. Yes. So, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. The Loss and Damage Fund, the SIDS fight for a Loss and Damage Fund. What are some of the milestones along the way? Well, last week I was in London doing some work for the Commonwealth Secretariat, training 30 young negotiators from across the Commonwealth on climate negotiations. And one of the things I said to them is, I'm trying to work with a screen, okay. One of the things I said to them is that to be a climate negotiator, there are three things that you must bear in mind. They are actually the 3 Ps: preparation, patience, and persistence. And this will show you what I mean. This discussion on loss and damage started in 1991, when AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States, actually proposed an insurance mechanism to address sea level rise and other impacts, loss and damage from sea level rise and other impacts of climate change, 1991. Okay, I'm trying to do this through a window and it's not working very well. Then we have the Bali Action Plan in 2003, I think it was, 4. And then this will just, in the interest of time, we'll just go through quickly to show you the major milestones along the way, to show you how we got to where we are right now, which is the establishment of a loss and damage fund at the last COP in Dubai. 1991 to 2023, that's 32 years. 32 years of persistence, 32 years of action on the part of EUSIS with support from others. And it was very interesting when Ruana spoke of the discussions that she had with a colleague, because I'll tell you my own experience, and I suspect it might actually be with the same colleague. This is the huddle. These are the intense negotiations that we had in Warsaw. And this is the huddle when it was we were almost on the verge of not having any agreement in Warsaw on loss and damage. We had run the risk of loss and damage dying and then being kicked along the road. And this huddle was on a Saturday. COPs usually end on Friday, so this was on the Saturday. I had 6 hours sleep. Don Pianathoniel, who's here today, had not slept for 36 hours. Many of the people in this huddle had not slept for 36 hours. This was not the most pleasant of huddles, for obvious reasons, but it was a very intense huddle, and it gave us the Warsaw International Mechanism on loss and damage. And you heard in the presentation that the minister gave that St. Lucia led the way, St. Lucia chaired, St. Lucia was on the first executive committee. Well, that was only one person, that's Dawn Pianathoniel. She's the one who basically led the charge for small island developing states and for EUSIS on loss and damage. When we went into Paris with a series of red lines, and there were things that we were, as small island developing states, very adamant that we wanted to get out of the Paris Agreement. One of them was 1.5 degrees Celsius as the long-term temperature goal, and the other one was loss and damage as a separate element in the Paris Agreement. The developed countries were adamant that loss and damage was just adaptation, and it was already captured under the Cancun Adaptation Framework. It was already captured under adaptation. They were not buying this argument that we were making, that loss and damage encompass those things that were beyond adaptation. You can't adapt to a Cat 5 hurricane destroying your country. You can't adapt to sea level rise that now inundates parts of your coastline and you've now lost that land completely. You can't adapt to coral bleaching as a result of ocean warming or ocean acidification. Your oceans becoming more acidic because they're being forced to absorb more carbon dioxide. You can't adapt to that. You know, your oceans, when they become more acidic, it's not like if you have an acid stomach, you could take some Tums, some Malox, and you're okay. You can't dump Tums or Malox into the ocean. So how do you adapt to that? So there's some things when you get past the limit of adaptation, that's where loss and damage comes in. And when we went into Paris, EUSIS, we got loss and damage in the Paris Agreement. And I'm being frustrated, okay. The Paris Agreement was a resounding triumph of multilateralism. What SIDS and other climate vulnerable countries achieved in Paris was historic. 1.5 degrees Celsius as a long-term temperature goal, and loss and damage as a separate element. And this is me speaking to this. Okay, we seem to have a technical problem.
Throughout the Caribbean. The separate treatment of loss and damage in the agreement is the most welcome development. While I pulled these two elements out for special mention, we view this agreement not as a combination of separate articles, but as a total package that will provide us with the legal framework for protecting our ecosystems, our islands, our people, our cultures, and our planet.
When we were negotiating the Paris Agreement, when we had, one of the things Laura Fabius, the president of the COP, did was set up ministerial contact groups. So St. Lucia, together with Norway, the minister from St. Lucia, myself, and the minister from Norway, Tina Sundtoft, we led the contact group that was responsible for landing the text on the long-term temperature goal. And I distinctly remember the delegate from one of the Arab countries coming to me and wagging his finger in my face and saying to me that you will get 1.5 over my dead body. So same language that was used to Rana, how many years later? 8 years later, on the question of the loss and damage fund. So it shows you the kind of opposition that small island developing states and least developed countries have to put up with, where they are already a victim and they have to be dealing with those issues. So what has happened since Paris? Well, the last 9 years are the hottest that we've seen since we started measuring temperatures since 1880. And that graph speaks for itself. You don't have to be a math wizard to understand what is going on. 2023 was the hottest year by far. It blew 2016 out of the water. And all indications are that 2024 will be hotter than 2023. August of this year broke a record, 11 straight months where every month set a record for the hottest month of its type ever. August was the only one that kind of stole that. This is a COP decision, COP27. Keeping the global average temperature rise to below 1.5 degrees Celsius will be essential to limiting future loss and damage and expressing alarm that the Working Group 2 of the 6th Assessment Report of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, concludes that the gravity, scope, and frequency of loss and damage will continue to increase with every additional fraction of a degree of temperature increase. So let that sink in. The gravity, the severity, the scope, the frequency of loss and damage will increase with every fraction of a degree. Where are we now? Well, we are nowhere near 1.5 degrees Celsius, the threshold for small island developing states. On current policies and action, we will get to 2.7 degrees Celsius. So status quo. If everybody does not what they say they will do, but what they are doing, we will get to 2.7 degrees Celsius. If we go by what they've set as their 2030 targets, we will get to 2.4 degrees Celsius. If they do what they've pledged to do and the targets they've set, we'll get to 2.1 degrees Celsius. Our most optimistic scenario, most optimistic, best case scenario has us landing somewhere between 1.5 and 2.4 degrees Celsius. That's where we are right now. So go back to what I said, go back to what the COP decision said about every incremental increase above 1.5, what that will do to loss and damage, and then you begin to get a picture of where we are. And this just shows you from the World Resources Institute what every increment above 1.5 degrees Celsius, what it does to the natural environment, what it does to water security, what it does to infrastructure, what it does to disaster risk management, what it does to food security. And these projections are quite ominous, they're quite scary, but that is the reality that we're faced with. We've heard about hurricanes. When we speak of loss and damage, we speak of extreme weather events. You heard Crispin speak about Hurricane Ivan, caused damage equivalent to 203% of Grenada's GDP. Dominica in 2015, when Tropical Storm Erica hit, that caused damage equivalent to over 90% of Dominica's GDP. 2 years later, when Hurricane Maria hit, over 200% of Dominica's GDP was lost in the space of 24 hours. When Irma hit the BVI, over 300% of damage, the 300% GDP damage to that country. So you could go from looking really good one day to being completely devastated the next day. That is the reality that Caribbean countries have to face every single hurricane season. Climate-related disasters are disproportionately bad for poorer households, and they also are much more impactful, fatal on low-income populations. So you see again the disparity. We have an intra-generational issue here that more vulnerable households, more vulnerable populations are much more impacted by extreme weather events. The annual adaptation costs in developing countries are currently in the range of between $160 to $340 billion. So that is what is needed by developing countries in order to adapt to the impacts of climate change. Right now, $160 to $340 billion. In Copenhagen, the developed world pledged $100 billion every year to developing countries like us that will be made available from 2020. We are way past the 100 billion requirement. We are in the vicinity of 160 to 340 billion dollars, with a requirement by 2030 of somewhere close to $500 billion. When we come to loss and damage, it's even worse. When we come to loss and damage, the estimate of the economic cost of loss and damage in 2020 was $435 billion, with it increasing to $500 billion by 2030. So that's on top of the funding requirement for adaptation. Funding requirement for adaptation, 160 to 340 billion dollars annually, not a lump sum, annually. The funding requirement for loss and damage, somewhere now in the vicinity of $435 billion. So these costs are spiraling way beyond the capacity of small island developing states. And as Rana said, they are leaving us with very little space to do anything. $100 billion was promised. How much have we mobilized? Nowhere near that amount. On an annual basis, I don't think we've ever gone to the point where we've seen more than $80 billion being mobilized. And even then, when you look at the source of that money, it is debatable whether it's actually $80 billion because there's a lot of double counting that's taking place. And the other thing that we're seeing is that most of the money is going towards mitigation and not adaptation. A lot of the money for adaptation is coming in the form of loans. So the people who have caused the climate crisis that we're dealing with are saying to us that we have to borrow money from them to adapt to a crisis that they have caused. So that's when you talk about climate justice, that's the issue that we're dealing with. COP28 established a loss and damage fund, and we were all elated because that was a culmination of years, of decades of hard work. And that loss and damage fund has been capitalized to the tune of, was it $700 million? 7 billion now? 700 million? $700 million. This was some work done by UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference for Trade and Development. It shows that the initial capitalization of the loss and damage fund should be $150 billion a year. Last year, we got a capitalization of $700 million. Okay, so what we saw last year, as promising and impressive as it was, only represents 0.2% of what is required on an annual basis. 0.2% of what is required on an annual basis. That's what was mobilized at COP last year, and really we've not seen much more since then. $700 million pledged to loss and damage fund, less than 0.2% of what is needed. However, the big 5 fossil fuel companies paid their shareholders an unprecedented $111 billion in 2023. This figure is 158 times what was pledged to developing countries in the loss and damage fund. Sorry, I'm being a little realistic for you, but I think we need to understand those things when we see what it is that we're up against. While important, the United Nations, and this is coming from an annual report of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, while important, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Loss and Damage mechanisms are not currently designed or intended in and of themselves to fulfill the human rights obligations. When we speak of non-economic losses, you know what we're also speaking of? Loss of lives. Those are some of the non-economic losses of loss and damage. You cannot put a value on human life. So when Hurricane Maria passes and kills people in Dominica, or you have Hurricane Beryl, or any one of these, you can't even value those. You can't value ecosystem loss. So when your ecosystems are damaged, there's no value put to this. So that's why Rohanna said that we are underestimating and undercounting the loss and damage, the cost of loss and damage to our countries and to our region. Averting loss and damage, minimizing and addressing loss and damage require immediate, effective, and fair mitigation. And that is from key messages on human rights and loss and damage. The International Court of Justice was asked to advise on states on climate justice and whether countries actually have an obligation to meet their responsibilities under the Paris Agreement. The reason the Paris Agreement was so easily adopted is because it is a gentleman's and gentlewoman's agreement. There are no legally binding commitments in it. Unlike the Kyoto Protocol, which had legally binding commitments, this is something that we all agree to. It is a triumph of multilateralism, but there is nothing that is legally binding in it. So that's why everybody agreed to it. But one of the agreements, one of the things that we had to commit to in getting loss and damage as a separate article in the Paris Agreement was paragraph 51 of the COP decision that said that there's nothing in here that speaks to liability and compensation. If we did not say that, we would not get loss and damage as a separate element. However, there are things in international law that allow states to address these issues outside of the framework of the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And that is what this opinion is seeking to address. And we saw Vermont becoming the first state in the United States to mandate that fossil fuel companies pay for climate damages. I believe that we have to pursue two tracks. We have to continue the excellent work that our negotiators are doing. People like Rana, like Dawn, and others who continue to punch way above their weight. And when you look at the delegations that we send compared to the delegations that the developed countries send, we are not anywhere near the size that they have, but we have more heart, we have more passion, and we have just as much intellectual capacity as they do. But that is not enough, because clearly, we cannot take 32 years to establish a loss and damage fund whilst all this havoc is going on around us. There must be a parallel track that takes place to give the negotiators some support outside of the UNFCCC framework. Time is running out, ladies and gentlemen. I would recommend you read this book, Where's the Justice? It's a compilation of how young people in the Caribbean see the Caribbean developing. It is very scary, it is very depressing, it is very pessimistic, but that is the reality that they're facing. And that is what we have to fight against. Thank you very much. And can I crave your indulgence and allow Keithlin to do her presentation, then take the questions rather than asking me questions? Yeah? Thanks.
Somebody has taken over my job. So given that request, Dr. Fletcher, of course, we have a lot of questions for you. A round of applause one more time for all that information he packed into that presentation. So we will indulge him, and I am very, very pleased to introduce to you an incredibly inspiring daughter of our soil. Our ladies rock, yeah? Let's head for St. Lucian ladies. The bias is obvious, I make no apologies. So this incredible daughter of our soil, Miss Keithlin Carew, she is a leader of our daughters as the founder and executive director of Helen's Daughters. Helen's Daughters works at a grassroots level, providing capacity development training, mentorship, micro-investment, access to high-value markets, and a structured care system for rural women farmers who have largely been unacknowledged and under-supported in the agricultural sector. Keithlin previously worked at the United Nations in various capacities covering gender inequality in peacekeeping and political affairs. She is a One Young World Ambassador, the recipient of the 2018 National Youth Award in Agriculture in St. Lucia, a Thought for Food Ambassador for the Caribbean, the first ever English-speaking Ashoka Fellow in Latin America and the Caribbean, an MBE recipient from Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, and the youngest and first Afro-Caribbean ICA Goodwill Ambassador. Mrs. Carew Afrifa will enlighten us on how loss and damage impacts women as well as sustainable development. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Mrs. Keithlin Afrifa.
Good evening, everyone. Excellencies, distinguished panelists. Thank you, Dr. Fletcher. You know we go together. The only problem is that I'm usually the opener, and I think Dr. Fletcher is better as a closer. He's a tough act to follow. It's truly an honor to be with you here all today, and of course this panel I really admire to discuss a topic that hits very close to home for me. The impact of loss and damage from climate change from the perspectives of women in agriculture and also how it affects sustainable development in the Caribbean. Dr. Fletcher mentioned three things: preparation, persistence, and patience. I can tell him that patience is something that civil society doesn't have when it comes to loss and damage. You've heard a lot about policy, about negotiations, and what I truly plan to do today is sort of root that and ground that into reality. In the global conversation on climate change, the issue of loss and damage has been gaining traction, quite obviously, particularly within UN climate negotiations. We've seen the world recognize the dire need to address the irreversible impacts of climate change, impacts that go beyond adaptation and mitigation. Yet, for those of us living and working in the Caribbean, loss and damage is not just a topic of negotiation. It is a lived reality. And it's a reality that is disproportionately affecting underserved communities such as women and threatens our region's progress towards sustainable development. At Helen's Daughters, some of you may know or may not know, we work very closely with women farmers who are the backbones of their communities, of their families. I look at these women, and I think as an organization, we look at them more than just farmers. They are caregivers, they are community leaders, and they are the linchpins of local economies. When climate disasters strike, it is these women who are left to pick up the pieces. They're the ones rallying their communities. They are the ones rationing resources and finding ways to maintain their livelihoods. Yet despite their crucial role, they are often the last to receive assistance and the first to feel the impacts of climate-induced loss and damage. When we first started Helen's Daughters in 2016, our 3 key areas of intervention were education and capacity development, such as our annual Agricultural Academy, market access and wealth creation, so some of you hopefully have been to our farmers market, and community building initiatives such as our rural health and wellness fairs. But every year, around June, I would notice that there is almost like a slight decline in some of the participation of the women that we worked with. And obviously, as an organization, you ask yourself, what's going on? Are we not doing enough? Are we not answering their issues? Are we not making these initiatives and programs attractive enough? And then I realized that the decline actually aligned with our hurricane season. You can teach, you can provide markets, you can do the exchanges, but when a woman loses her house, for example, or she loses a field of crop that essentially was supposed to supplement that income for a month or 2, you don't want to attend a training program. You don't want to be part of an organization. Survival takes precedence. And essentially, from 2016, we have slowly shifted, or in a sense, tried to create a balance in between our regular programming and investing more and more in recovery. So we first started this after the November 6th trough in the northern part of St. Lucia. We were forced to find funding for the recovery of some of our members, and that was about 5% of the budget. Then, in 2023, Tropical Storm Brett, the budget allocation for recovery rose to 7%. Now, in 2024, our recovery efforts after Hurricane Beryl, particularly for our women farmers in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, doubled. It rose to 15%. This goes to show you that each year we brace ourselves now for another hurricane season or even a drought, knowing full well that another disaster can disrupt livelihoods, food security, and well-being. Climate impacts continue to intensify, placing additional strain on our resources. And with the loss and damage, while close to being operational, 2028 is not soon enough. CSOs are left to fill the gaps using limited donor funding, and we essentially are compelled to rely on our own networks and partnerships to continue to build up, to continue to support disaster relief and recovery, which in a sense is not sustainable in the long term. It drains our capacity for those who serve these communities, and it also undermines our capacity to respond effectively in future crises. We have been forced, essentially, to direct precious resources into recovery. We have been forced to become responders because we realize that in order to be an integral part of our membership's development, that means being a part of their recovery as well. But recovery is just one piece of the puzzle. Many persons don't understand sometimes the inner workings of a nonprofit organization. Sometimes people think that the manna falls from the sky in terms of money and that we're supposed to just give it out freely. That's not how it works. Approximately 85% of the funding at Helen's Daughters is actually restricted to predefined programs, usually outlined a year or 2 in advance. And what people don't realize is that it sometimes feels like our funders maybe believe that we have some form of clairvoyance where we can foresee the future and foresee the disasters and the hurricanes that come, but obviously that's not the case. And what's worse is that our beneficiaries don't understand this disproportionate difference between restricted and unrestricted funding. So when you create a sense of community, you create a family, when a disaster occurs, there's also an expectation for that family member, for that community member to step up and to help. And there's no cognizance or realization that this restricted funding cannot meet basic survival needs. And this is where it limits our abilities to essentially address immediate unforeseen crises like extreme weather events. And essentially, it also breaks the bonds with a community that we had been trying to foster and create for years and years and years. And this reality is a stark reminder of why we increasingly seek to partner with trust-based philanthropists, those who understand that the impact of climate change demands flexibility and swift response. No offense to the Loss and Damage Fund, but there are other funders out there who understand the need for immediate and direct relief. And that's essentially who we are trying to work with. We need funders who trust as well local organizations, who trust our cultural understanding of the situations that we face, and who are willing to work with us and trust how best we allocate the resources in the wake of a disaster. A recent development in UN climate negotiations, of course, we mentioned the Loss and Damage Fund was aimed at providing financial support to vulnerable nations. However, the challenges surrounding the fund have several implications for civil society. First and foremost, there is limited access to immediate relief. Civil society organizations like Helen's Daughters work directly with communities on the front lines of climate change. But the delays in the establishment and the disbursement of the Loss and Damage Fund mean that we have fewer resources to provide immediate relief to those affected by extreme weather impact and slow onset climate impacts such as sea level rise and desertification. Civil society organizations like ours are on the front lines directly facing the impacts of climate change, while funding and policy changes remain slow to materialize. But there are issues deeper than the physical and infrastructural damages that have affected us as Caribbean persons. And I recognize that I sort of recognized this a bit later, actually this year, after Hurricane Beryl, when the request wasn't for funding, actually, from our membership. The request was for psychological support after the passage of Hurricane Beryl. We had to actually release a request for proposals to establish a telehealth line for female farmers and their families to provide counseling support. We even had to have sessions on psychological first aid because of the trauma experienced by our members in islands like Meru and Union Island after the passage of Hurricane Beryl, because they became homeless overnight. This aspect of recovery is often overlooked in international negotiations. Dr. Fletcher mentioned death, but how can you quantify psychological trauma, PTSD, stress, fear, and so forth? The impacts of climate change on the human psyche cannot be quantified in dollars and cents. So what can we do as a small civil society organization? Obviously, we can't work the way that we can. We try to find partners and we try to find solutions because we have to. We can't wait until 2028, unfortunately. So what have we done in the absence of a recovery fund and immediate relief? We've partnered with, for example, organizations like CARE International and the Caribbean Gender Alliance. We've bolstered our internal systems for responding to disaster. We've underwent training with the CALP network to deploy and understand how to deploy cash and voucher assistance after a disaster, which has proven to be quite effective because, again, civil society has the capacity to deploy CVA if trained thoroughly, more efficiently and faster, for example, than a government agency. So essentially, when you look at it, we have inadvertently added a fourth pillar of intervention, which is focused on recovery in the work at Helen's Daughters. In the coming year as well, because of this, we are now working on essentially establishing our own recovery fund at Helen's Daughters so that it can be agile and activated immediately after a disaster. And we're a relatively small nonprofit. But part of building resilience is forming strong partnerships. We cannot do this alone. Before Hurricane Beryl hit, I remember we partnered with Caritas Antilles. We got to know them actually after the cash and voucher assistance training that we had taken. And we were the only local organization present at that cash and voucher assistance, and it was held here in St. Lucia. We essentially, with Caritas Antilles, we conducted emergency preparedness planning for our members. And honestly, this partnership was instrumental. We gathered women farmers together to develop strategies for disaster preparedness, understand supply chain vulnerabilities, and create rapid response networks. Honestly, you'd be surprised how a WhatsApp phone tree can be instrumental in a hurricane. The impact of this planning was evident after Beryl. Farmers who participated in the training were better equipped to secure their assets and coordinate relief efforts and find shelter if needed. However, what I have noticed is that our experience also revealed a significant challenge: the fragmentation of the recovery ecosystem in the Caribbean. We can talk about loss and damage all night. I mean, that's what we're here for. But at the same time, we need to be a bit accountable. There is a disconnect between policy agents and on-the-ground actors. Agents at the policy level often create frameworks without consulting those who are directly affected, while grassroots organizations struggle to access the necessary support in a timely manner. This essentially leads to and hinders the effective response and recovery. For example, while we were able to mobilize support through our network, the process highlighted the need for more streamlined communication and collaboration. And finally, it leads me really to the point of representation. It's a known fact that there is inadequate representation of civil society perspectives in the conversation on loss and damage. CSOs play a vital role in advocating for the needs of marginalized communities, in my case, especially women. However, if we are not adequately included in the decision-making processes, the resulting policies may fail to fully address the realities on the ground. For example, I was fortunate to be a part of the Caribbean Climate Action 2030 Citizen Advisory Group under the Biden-Harris administration for the efforts to address climate change in the Caribbean region. And this initiative was a small step, but at least it showed the recognition of the voices of civil society, and it also recognized the unique challenges the Caribbean faces, especially in terms of loss and damage. But CAG 2030 also showed, after spending a year and a half of putting together recommendations and so forth, that, and we know this all too well, politics can significantly impact the continuity of climate change efforts. With the US elections, for example, with the Citizen Advisory Group on the horizon, the recommendations and strategies we brought forward under the CAG 2030 could face changes, could just not be implemented. While the group's work is rooted in the best available science and driven by the needs of vulnerable communities, the reality is that political shifts can alter priorities and funding allocations. And for me, and I hope for you all, it's a stark reminder of the fragile nature of climate policy and the importance of building resilient frameworks that can withstand political changes. This uncertainty makes the role of civil society even more crucial. I've always said this: civil society is that steady force advocating for consistent and actionable climate policies regardless of the political landscape. We need to see policies that are adaptable and responsive. We need increased financial flows that can be deployed quickly to affected areas. Our experience has shown that cash and voucher assistance, for example, has been vetted, when vetted with organizations that are appropriately trained, can be a game changer in the CSO space because it provides timely support. But establishing these systems require time, effort, and collaboration. Through our work, we are building these frameworks for effective disaster response, but we cannot do this alone. Global policies must reflect the realities on the ground, and they must prioritize for those who most need it. the impact of loss and damage on underserved communities. I really don't like the phrase vulnerable groups actually. Underserved communities, for example, women, and sustainable development in the Caribbean is profound. But the global conversation must translate into local action. Partnerships between policy-level agents and those on the ground are key to creating a seamless ecosystem for recovery. It is up to us to ensure that these discussions lead to real, timely support for these communities who are the glue holding our region together. We need to work together. Let's create a future where resilience is not just about recovery, but about having the resources to continue to thrive despite the challenges we face. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Ms. Karu Afrifa, I know we are waiting to hear from all of our panelists, so allow me to invite Dr. Fletcher back to the podium. Mr. Duvet and Ambassador and Ms. Haynes, please join us as well. And we have some time for question and answer. And we also have an active online audience, so we do have some questions from them as well. But the floor is now open. To you, our audience, in person and online, we have a first question there. I'm happy if you identify yourself as you ask your question. Please come forward. Yes. Just touch the, yeah.
Good evening, panel. Thank you very much, everyone. James Crockett, Fauna and Flora, conservation organisation that works in the Caribbean and around the world. Just wanted to acknowledge Dr. Fletcher and Ms. Karu's contributions in particular, because it speaks very much to where do we get the money from to do the work that we need to do. And I feel that we are expecting the rich countries to pay for our loss and damage and our adaptation, but those countries are also in debt. The British government put out 700 billion or whatever it was during COVID. They say they're broke. Who's got the money? And when you speak to the insurance companies who are putting all their money somewhere to get a return, they're giving it to the oil and gas companies. So where is the money that we need? And NGOs like ours, how do we be in the mainstream of the economy, not sitting at the side looking for crumbs? So my view is that we need to find a methodology and a model that inserts civil society and NGOs into the mainstream of economic activity. Coming from a conservation organisation, that means how do we use nature-based solutions to mitigate our risk and reduce our vulnerabilities? How do we put nature back in the middle of the solution? Because if we are working in NGOs to reduce impacts through making more resilient and healthy habitats, so upland forests and coral reefs and dune structures and so on, which reduce the impact on our infrastructure, there should be an economic model that helps us do that work rather than statutory grant funding. If the insurance companies see reduced risks from having lesser impacts from having a healthy environment, surely there must be a model that allows the insurers to give a kickback to the people paying for the insurance through investing in those nature-based solutions. I may not be explaining it, but I hope you get the gist that we need to mainstream NBS in our activities, and the insurance sector's got a role to play. Do we see that, and can we explore that collaboratively as NGOs and civil society? Because I think waiting for the big guys at the top to do it, we're going to struggle. Thank you.
James, all I can say is ditto, I agree. You must use nature-based solutions as an integral part of the response. But the question of how do you finance it, one of the slides I put up there, I think, shows it. Let's put it this way. If you are to provide financial support so that underserved communities, vulnerable communities are able to develop resilience, there are two ways of doing it. There is by redistributing some of the wealth that's already there, or by putting more pressure on the production systems to cater for the people who are struggling right now. By putting more pressure on production systems, you worsen the situation. So to me, the way to deal with the situation is by causing those who have been making an obscene amount of money from the fossil fuel sector, redistributing that money so that it goes to the people who are being impacted. I think that is the way in which you do it. You can't have the fossil fuel sector paying out $111 billion in dividends to shareholders and emissions of greenhouse gases continuing to rise. They haven't peaked yet, continuing to rise. And the consequence of that is countries like ours have to deal with worse hurricane seasons, more droughts. Countries in the Pacific like Vanuatu and Kiribati have to face the prospect of disappearing completely. Communities like Dennery, where the minister represents, have to face the prospect of retreating because that coastline is no longer available. So I think that is the question that we have to answer. It's a difficult one. It's a difficult one that nobody wants to deal with, but you have to. I also take the point that you make about some of the developed countries that we're looking for the money from don't have it. I was just in the UK and a friend of mine said to me, and I apologize if I come across as being indelicate, but the UK right now has a third world economy parading as a developed country. That's what it is, unfortunately. So it does not have that largesse to be able to give to us. I mean, that's not something that I would say in negotiating circles because we still want the UK to be able to put the money out. But a lot of them just don't have it. So, but the people who have the money are the fossil fuel companies that are making the money. And I think that's where the redistribution has to take place.
Just very briefly, I think indeed one of the big questions that we are facing and that we will be facing at the next COP is really broadening the base for finance. I mean, it's clear that financing cannot only be public financing alone. The UK was mentioned. I'm sure Germany is in a similar position. So we have to broaden finance, and you mentioned oil companies. I think that's something that certainly could be looked at. The private sector, philanthropists were mentioned. The question of reform of financial institutions, multilateral banks, and so on. So all this to say that it's more than just looking at the budgets of countries like the UK or Germany.
Before I get to you, there was a gentleman who was making his way to the mic, so let me allow him.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Ricardo, founder of HD Caribbean. I'm also director of Lucian, and I'm also affiliated with GONG. That's the Global Gas and Oil Network. So as you mentioned, in regards to tapping into funding with fossil fuels, I believe that we should put things in place in regards to taxing and sectioning how these companies drill for oil or export for oil in the Caribbean region, which also can be detrimental to our seas, to our fish life if there is an oil spill. So there's a heavy drilling that's going on in Trinidad and Guyana and all these places. There's a lot of going on in these places. I know that's a very difficult task, but I do believe that we need to put things in place in order to tax ships that do come through our region. A lot of waste is done to the seas from these large cruise ships and these oil companies to see how we can put stuff in place to get funding from these organizations to facilitate what we were just talking about.
Thank you so much for that contribution. We'll have the next question, and you can respond to both of our
Good afternoon or good evening. My name is Leighton Khan, and I'm from a local insurance brokerage firm, Agostini Insurance Brokers. And I'm here because I'm really interested in what we're talking about, loss and damage and the climate crisis. And we really can't have a discussion about the climate crisis without thoroughly discussing insurance. And I was happy to hear this gentleman raise the issue of insurance. And I don't think much is being said about the insurance industry and the role it plays in being able to recover your ladies and Helen's daughters when they suffer loss and damage. It's the insurance company that's going to be their first port of call. That's the place that gets the call that I've had damage, I need help. And while climate change is happening, there's another change going on that we're not talking about, and it's the insurance market change. I just coined that term, but it is a really significant change that is happening right now. And what it's doing is compounding climate change. It's making being able to cope with climate change so much worse right now, because the change in the insurance market is actually moving at a faster pace than climate change. Because the premiums are shifting at such a rate now that people cannot afford insurance. I spent last Christmas with my colleague over there trying desperately to renew the insurance on a hotel that was by the water. An insurance company that carried this risk 100% said, look, we can only take 60% of the risk this year. And we're scrambling during my Christmas break trying to find placement for the other 40% for this one hotel. And this hotel didn't even have major losses in the past. So this change in the insurance market is threatening the lives and livelihoods of people who are at the end of this food chain. We talk about the big picture and all that's happening with the loss and damage fund. I don't know much about it, but I hope somewhere in that fund is something for the reinsurance market, because that's what's affecting the local insurance company. And the gentleman here, you're from the mecca of reinsurance. I don't know what your government can do to assist the local insurance companies. There's been a lot of talk about forming a reinsurance company with a big conglomerates in the Caribbean. We're still waiting for that to happen because it's a lack of reinsurance capacity why we're suffering now with the rates that we have to pay. So, Jimmy, we need to infuse insurance in the conversation and build a strong, resilient insurance market. Otherwise, we're doomed. Thank you.
Mr. Khan, anyone wants to respond to?
A few quick comments, if I might, and Leighton, thank you for that contribution. I think it's really crucial. And in fact, I was talking to a specialist, an insurance specialist at CRIF, the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, and I was surprised to learn how low the penetration of insurance is in the region. So many people are not insured. So many, properties, people generally cannot afford insurance. And one of the things to remember is, even if the Caribbean islands themselves don't get hit, if, say Florida gets hit, the rates go up, we are affected even if we're not directly hit. So these are things that we have to consider. And certainly, there has to be a major space for insurance in the conversation. So, I will not hog the floor. The other things
Leighton, you're absolutely right. In fact, one of the, I gave an address to the Insurance Association of the Caribbean. I think it was in the Bahamas a couple of years ago, and that was the whole thrust of it, that insurance is one of those sectors that is so heavily impacted by climate change, and I do not believe that the insurance sector itself understands. Some people do. Clearly you do, but many of the players in the insurance sector, I think, do not understand the gravity of this problem. And Crispin is right, insurance penetration is low. CRIF is one avenue that has worked very well, that parametric insurance avenue, but we need to expand it now because farmers who experience drought, and Keithan can tell you, drought is as devastating to a farmer as flooding. There are farmers who farm in St. Lucia along the Marquis River who have to abandon their farms every dry season because they just cannot get sufficient stream flow to irrigate their vegetables. But there's another issue here, and you spoke about that dilemma of reinsuring a hotel that was built near the water. We, in our planning, must stop allowing hotels to be built near the water. Because we cannot be saying that sea level rise will inundate large swathes of our coastline, that sea level rise will cause, I remember Crispin saying to me that he had looked at some models for the shock area, and it showed that the sea encroaching, I think, as far as the roundabout it was, Crispin, I think you had said to me. But we continue to allow hotels to be built right on the water's edge because we have this stupid notion that every tourist who comes to our country wants to walk out of their room and curl their toes in the sand. Well, what will happen is that many of these rooms will become overwater suites very soon at the level of sea level rise that's taking place. So they're making your life more difficult because our planning is not climate informed. And for the life of me, I do not understand how our governments all across the Caribbean are continuing to approve investments and give planning permission to hotels to be built on the same waters that they themselves go and speak to the international community and say will be flooded in a few years. Make it make sense.
Whilst you think of your other questions or responses, let me just take our very active online participants. There seems to be a cry for pressuring governments from a couple of our participants. Jane Hippolyte in particular asked, how do we effectively pressure the governments that are subsidizing and encouraging the activities of the fossil fuel companies?
Well, to be honest, I don't know the government, our domestic government is doing that. I don't know that the government of St. Lucia is doing that. I think that question by Jane is a very genuine one, but it's not really a question for us because I don't know that the government of St. Lucia or most of the other governments in the Eastern Caribbean are subsidizing fossil fuel companies. In fact, I think what they're doing is trying their best to accelerate the transition to renewables, not doing it fast enough, to be honest. I think we need to accelerate that transition. And speaking, wearing my other hat as chairman of the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, I think there's a lot more that we need to do to accelerate that transition. But I don't know that we are subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. The question that you raised about Ghana and Trinidad is a very important. Ghana right now is growing at the rate of 34% or 30 to 40% GDP per annum. Now, a lot of people are saying, well, Ghana is doing the same thing that it said to other countries to not do. And Ghana is saying, well, I need to be given the space to develop the same way you developed, and you're the ones who caused the problem. But had Ghana said to the international community, I do not want to exploit my fossil fuel sector. I want to leave the oil and gas in the ground, and you pay me to leave the oil and gas in the ground. You think they would have been sympathetic to that? And that's the problem, you know. So, common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. That great constructive ambiguity in the UNFCCC. That's what allows that to happen.
Is it on? Yes. So maybe I'll just add a few thoughts to the discussion, and I really appreciate the very well-considered proposals and questions that have been posed. And I want to agree in large part with what has already been said, included by the fellow panelists. On this issue of reform, economic reform, ensuring that we have alternative sources of finance, that we're not just depending on public budgets, it is an extremely critical topic of discussion. It is one that, yes, I agree there needs to be pressure coming from the bottom up. And as Keithlin had explained, there is a lot of work happening in the region among civil society organizations, actually also demanding access to some of these international funds, direct access, including to the Loss and Damage Fund. And this is something that is still being heavily debated and under discussion. So that is one aspect of it. There was also an entire campaign led by the Caribbean Natural Resources Institute around the SIDS4 conference that took place in Antigua in May, where there is a civil society action plan that was agreed that is very clearly laying out this issue and the need for exactly that, integrating civil society more into the actual activities that are happening on the ground in the region, and allowing them access to the funding to be able to assist what governments are doing. Because as we all understand, civil society is normally at the forefront and government is somehow usually trailing behind. And there are many reasons for that in the region that we live in. On this question of the broader structural reform, I guess the point I want to make is that we can't have one thing and not the other. So it's not just a question of top-down decisions needing to be taken or bottom-up work needing to be done. It has to be both, happening at the same time and in a manner that is coordinated. So yes, there's a lot of work that can be done from the bottom up, and there's a lot that still has to be done in this region. There's a lot of awareness and education that still has to happen because people have to demand better of their governments in order for governments to be able to do better, for the most part. But there also has to be, at the international level, structural reform. And the ambassador mentioned the discussion on the reform of the international financial institutions, and Jimmy just touched on this, the question of what if Guyana had said, you know what, we're going to keep it in the ground. What next? What next for Guyana? And this is not a hypothetical question. We have the actual case of the government of Colombia. Their current administration, since they came into power, took exactly that decision. Now, this is a state, primarily the economy is based on fossil fuel extraction. And the current administration took a decision that they will not exploit certain resources because they want to change the direction of the economy. They want to grow in a manner that supports decarbonization and renewable energy. And you know what happened the next day? Their credit rating was downgraded at the international level. So it is not a question just of what we can do as individuals. Of course, we all have a responsibility. It is not just a question of what we do even in small countries in our governments. There is a bigger fish to fry. In the case of the actual international financial system that is set up not to reward efforts at sustainability, but actually to punish them. That is the way the system is set up at this time. And so you can understand in that context why it is a very daunting prospect for countries that are already heavily debt-ridden to be able to say, we want to radically change direction because it is the right thing to do, knowing full well that that will lead to probably even more marginalization and hardship and probably the loss of an election cycle, let's face it, within the countries that they represent. And so there are a number of multifaceted issues, I think is what Crispin described it as, multifaceted issues here that need to be addressed. And I hope when we continue these discussions, we can have our eye on also the bigger picture. Thanks.
I just wanted to add another point. Hello? Oh, particularly on finance. Hello? Okay. Particularly on financial flows. I think in the Caribbean, when it comes to development, we usually think of attracting funders and so forth, again, in terms of the World Bank, the Loss and Damage Fund, at this very high-level space. And what I found is that as a region, we have not been able to attract very different type of funding. For example, when you look at Latin America and the existence of impact investment, for example, even with us, when you look at Dr. Fletcher, Clara Lionel Foundation, that is one of our major funders, for example, that's trust-based philanthropists. And there are plenty of those types of philanthropists outside of the world that have lots and lots of money that are willing to fund. But I think that the Caribbean has not been doing a very good case in advocating for ourselves. And I think also that our idea when it comes to development sometimes is focused on one-off projects. Always a quick 20,000 for a soccer game or a quick 30,000 for a health drive rather than long-term solutions. And long-term solutions, you need to attract those long-term partners. And I think finally, the Caribbean region, we have a difficulty in understanding that there's a difference between charity and philanthropy, and we're past charity. We need to focus on philanthropy at this time and long-term interventions that can essentially impact our sustainable development. And I think also just looking at the frameworks of development again is that St. Lucia has, dare I say it, but in many cases, a very weak civil society sector. And that's not because of, I think, the will of the people that want to create organizations to create a change and so forth, but because of the difficulties and the obstacles in actually creating those mechanisms that support governments and support long-term development. I mean, for example, even when we had to get a bank account for Helen's daughters, it took us 2 years. It's just these little obstacles that essentially we don't mention and we don't talk about. And again, we are partners in development. We're not hindrances. We are actually there to ease the burden, in my opinion, of governments as well.
I can just to say, that point is well noted, really well noted. And I think the whole issue of finance, I mean, the old saying money makes the money fly. There are a number of factors to be considered. Okay, I certainly agree that we need to broaden, our view with regard to finance and don't just look at, public or look at necessarily bilateral only, look at philanthropic and so on. And in fact, the OECS is starting to move in that direction. We've actually been able to secure, some resources in that regard. But I think there's some. In that context, however, we have to look at a few things. And speaking from the OECS experience, where we have 11 member states and almost half of them are, overseas territories, for example, the UK overseas territories, who in most instances are not eligible for ODA funding. It is always a challenge for them and for us when we want to involve them in regional projects because, this partner says, I'm sorry, we can't fund the UK overseas territories, and that is sometimes where the philanthropies come in. But I think collectively, we really have to work on our intel, find out where those sources are, who's able to tap what, and so on. And if there's some resources that are not open to governments, but they're open to civil society. So then we then have to alert our civil society, hey guys, this funding is available for you and so on. In some cases, it's a mix where it can be government and civil society, that kind of thing. So we really have to work more closely together. And the other thing that we have to, one of the continuous, the eternal bugbears we have is the whole issue of ease of access. We hear that, there's a green climate fund, there's, all kind of funds, adaptation fund and so on. But to write a project, for a government, for example, to write a project to the Green Climate Fund is not an easy process. You have to go for a lot of hoops, and there's some people around the world who specialize in that stuff. Unfortunately, there are not as many people in the region who are capable of doing this, or have the experience. It's not the capability, but the experience. And it is something we have to already build that cadre, build that talent in the region. So, even if the funding around the world is inadequate, or the available funding is not adequate, but to maximize our share of that, or what we get from it, I think we really have to build that capacity in the region. Thanks.
Thank you so much, panelists. I was about to wrap up, but it looks like we have one more question. We do have a time limit here.
I'll be very brief.
Brief.
All right. My name is Chris Emmanuel. I'm from the Ministry of Equity and Social Justice. My question is directed to Mr. Crispin. You spoke about displacement and migration due to loss and damage. The Cartagena 40 process is including the Caribbean and Latin America in its Chile Declaration Plan of Action. What is OECS stand and input into the declaration? Is there a focus on implementing a legal framework to deal with the issues that brought up as a result of forced displacement and migration?
Thanks for the question. We have not, I have to say, we have not had a direct engagement or input in that particular process, okay? Not directly. So we've not been part of negotiations or particular discussions in that regard. But the principles that we've been working, for example, closely, for example, IOM, the Institute on Migration, for example, under the...
Just shift it.
Somebody's trying to... Again, okay. So, I'm going to talk about the mic then. Yes, but the work we have been doing, okay, in terms of human mobility, generally the principles, looking at the strategic approaches and so on, I think would adequately consider all the various factors and the realities. And of course, our particular circumstances in the OECS where we have a particular focus on free movement and so on. I think we've captured a lot of the principles, even if not everything is in place at the moment.
Okay, thank you for the response.
Thank you.
Good evening, Onika Ben. I'm the NDC. Oh, you can hear me much better now. Great. Onika Ben. I'm the NDC and Country Facilitator for St. Lucia. I'm embedded within the Department of Sustainable Development. So it's really good to hear the conversation about finance and financing for loss and damage. However, one of the very important things that we need to consider to access finance is credible data. And just coming back to the point that Ruana made about the report that will be launched in December at the COP, my question is posed to her as it relates to the work of climate analytics and perhaps some of the other members at the table. Coming out of that report, do we have a proposed model that can work with Caribbean governments and other persons that are working to quantify the losses or track what is happening in the region so that we can start collecting better data and therefore access the funding? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that very difficult question. And I'm going to direct you to one of our experts here at Climate Analytics, who is on our science team that has been working very hard and trying to design tools to help countries to generate the data that they will need to support proposals and to support proposal writing for accessing funding. The report itself is really geared more towards highlighting some of the policy issues for consideration. We hope that once it is launched, we will be able to attract further funding to be able to do more work on it. Because what we've noticed is that even though our leaders speak about these issues of debt and speak about loss and damage, and we know that they're linked, there is perhaps an entire policy agenda that is missing in order to ensure that the issues can actually be addressed. And it will include looking at innovative forms of financing, such as insurance as well, as one of the proposed solutions. So the report is geared more towards filling the policy level gap, but we are doing work elsewhere in the organization that is geared more towards generating actual data. But on both ends, we hope that the work that is produced will help countries to be able to, have a better basis for being able to approach funders to address the issues. Thanks.
I just wanted to also add a point with regards to data. I think that, again, when I mentioned that topic of the Caribbean not essentially advocating well enough for ourselves, I think that lack of data is very much present in that argument. And one of the things that essentially has been a strength for Helen's Daughters is that we have found ways to essentially collect that feedback and that data. Literally, we're right now in the process of milling all our data into Salesforce, which is already a pre-existing solution that, huge corporations are using. And what many persons within the region don't even realize is that it's actually free to non-profit organizations once you register with. And on top of that, Salesforce at this point is now a new non-profit package that's backed by artificial intelligence. So essentially, if I wanted to see the differences or the track the impact of Helen's Daughters on a farmer from the year she entered until year 5, how many trainings, how much disaster assistance she's received, how much money she's making within a farmer's market, I can literally do that in a couple of clicks. So I think sometimes with the Caribbean region also, we're trying to constantly reinvent tools rather than looking for tools that actually exist.
Our in-person audience, we're going to invite you to stay back and interact with our panelists, but we absolutely have to bring the discussion to an end. But we will stay around just a little longer to do that. Let me really extend sincere thanks to our distinguished presenters, and please show your appreciation for them at this time. We have really brought this into focus, and I hope there can be ongoing discussion and the deepening of the knowledge that they have shared with the region. And we want to say sincere thanks as well to the Embassy of the Federal Republic of Germany for facilitating this excellent event. So once again, let's show our appreciation. And I thank our online viewers as well. And I hope Climate Analytics goes back to all of your questions and comments and response. And we thank you so much and wish you an enjoyable evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Now that we're off air, I can tell you there are refreshments and we can have our conversation to continue.